on this episode of Spirit Talk.
In the paranormal field, I think they're all vulnerable, especially when it's domestic cases. And at the center of any ethical considerations for any case is, are you leaving the case with the person in the same state that they were before you arrived, or better? If they're worse, ethics hasn't happened, in my book.
Hi, I'm Chris Fleming, the creator of Spirit Talk. You're listening to the podcast where I'll be bringing you the greatest thinkers, researchers, and contributors from around the world to discuss what we know in the field of the paranormal, life after death, and the pursuit of higher consciousness. Hello, this is Chris Fleming, and welcome to this month's edition of Spirit Talk. I'm excited about my guest. You may have seen him on Most Haunted, Celebrity Ghost Hunt Live, Ghost Adventures, and other various paranormal shows that he's appeared on as himself, but also he's done a lot of consulting in the past for certain paranormal programs as well as for certain TV shows. It's none other than Dr. Ciarán O'Keeffe, and you can say his name a couple different ways. Ciarán, Ciarán. I always get it mixed up, so I apologize sometimes during this podcast, you may hear me mispronounce his name just slightly, all right? His resume is impressive. He's an English psychologist specializing in parapsychology and forensic psychology. Now, he's currently employed at Bucks University, and he's held a research associate position at the University of Toulouse in Les Marais, also an online tutor position at Derby University. He was previously employed at Liverpool, Hope University, lecturing in psychology with a parapsychology component. Now, O'Keeffe is a member of the Society for Psychical Research and a senior advisor to the Ghost Club. Now, according to his website, he completed his PhD at the University of Hertfordshire under the supervision of Richard Wiseman and Julia Buckroy. Now, he double majored in music and psychology. He then completed a Master of Science in Investigative Psychology at the University of Liverpool before studying for his PhD at the University of Hertfordshire. He's currently the academic head of department and senior lecturer for psychology at Buckinghamshire New University. All of this is very impressive. So please check out his websites that I will have listed on the planetparanormal.com page under Spirit Talk for this podcast. And these links will take you to some of the important articles and research that he's written. Some of these topics we'll discuss today in the podcast. So let's get started, because this is a long interview, and I know he and I could have spoken much longer. I hope to have him on in the future, and I definitely want to keep in touch with him because I can sit back and listen to him all day, because he is a wealth of information, and his fresh perspectives and obviously educated perspectives are something that we all need to consider. So let's get to it.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm all right.
Fantastic. Well, you know, Ciarán, I've been wanting to have you on as a guest for years now. And I don't know if you've ever heard of my podcast, Spirit Talk.
I haven't, but I was going to listen to it because you recently do the medium from Alex Holzer's show?
Yes,
yeah.
Holzer Files. Yes, and that was a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, so yeah, I'd love to listen to that.
Wonderful. Please do. I've been doing this now 16 years, and the reason why I did this was, one, to kind of tell my experiences in the beginning, but more importantly, to have people that I interview share their stories, tell us about their background, their experiences, and how they're contributing to the field, or what they can contribute. And the fields I'm talking about is not just paranormal. I mean, I started out just doing kind of paranormal, but I personally, in my own research, has gone into higher consciousness, expanding that, how to better yourself. But then also we talk about, UFOs, strange phenomena, intelligence, and dealing with the military, and just whatever it is that people will be like, wow, And you being a parapsychologist, I mean, I'm friends with Lloyd Aubuck.
Oh, brilliant.
I know when I did Dead Famous, I worked with him a lot. And I don't know if he knows this or not, but I'm very grateful for the guidance he gave me. He used to tell me stuff like, Chris, what you're doing is this, because I didn't know the terms for my abilities. So he would say, you're doing this, you're doing that. Oh, that's what that term is called. I didn't even know. So I've interviewed him in the past, and Dr. Paracetti, Pamela Heath, Cal Cooper, and a couple other individuals, but I've always wanted to interview you because I know your name came up a lot when we were doing, I think it was Dead Famous. And I said, I got to look into this guy because he's in the UK.
But also that whole period, it was, I have to be honest, because I very much knew of you at that time, because our paths were kind of, I think Dead Famous was on the same channel as Most Haunted at that time.
Living TV, yes.
Yeah, Dead Famous was getting a great following. Most Haunted was kind of happening at the same time. You were doing that with Gail,
right?
I was doing Most Haunted with Yvette, and it was like this. And I thought at some point, come on, we're bound to meet.
Yes,
at some Living TV thing or something like that, and it just never happened. And here we are, all these years later. And
yeah, sadly, never did.
Yeah, it's just good to connect.
Yes, it is. I know they had talked at one point about doing a live or something like that, but I think the network wanted to keep it separate, America and British. But I can't really remember the details. The thing that was fascinating for me that I just want to share with you, because you're a parapsychologist, but also, you're a psychologist. The whole fascinating thing for me about the paranormal was growing up having these experiences was I didn't have anybody from a scientific or a medical standpoint to talk to. Just my parents would say either ignore it. Or my mom would say, don't talk about it outside the house. Just this is what you deal with. I was disappointed, Ciarán, when I went to college. I went to liberal arts school. I went there to play football, but I was going to get a degree in psychology and in art. And I got a degree in fine art, a BA. And as I was going through psychology, I got discouraged that there was nothing there for me regarding the paranormal. So I studied abnormal psychology, creative psychology, and in abnormal psychology, I would ask questions to the professors. We talk about manic depression, but we also talk about schizophrenia. And I say, is there any studies been done that the hallucinations that these people see, if the hallucinations are similar, and if they're identifying something that we don't normally see? And professor completely ignored me and told everybody to turn to page 22, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, well, that's a legitimate question. Is it? I didn't understand that, they don't really research and study that stuff in psychology.
Absolutely.
So for me, it was disappointing. I had nothing to go to. As time went on, then I learned what I could with psychology, but I did not complete my degree, unfortunately, and I wish I did. But I am fascinated by individuals that have dedicated their life to psychology and to parapsychology, and whether they're on the fence on one side or the other doesn't matter to me. The fact that matters is that they are open to research and to study ESP, to study strange phenomena we don't understand caused by the environment, or even dimensional stuff that we don't understand that's coming from our plane and going to another plane. But then also the medical diagnosis, the psychological explanations. I love to hear from people like you and what your experiences have been, what type of conclusions or at least theories that you have, as well as some of the skepticism.
Sure.
Because you're one of the pioneers that your name comes up a lot, and it's something that many people can learn from. They might not learn everything from all of us, but they might learn bits and pieces, and that's important to my listeners. So there's a couple topics, I want to just throw out there, and whatever topics you would like to talk about,
okay,
let's pursue, have a conversation. I'd like to know, because I know you have must have had some type of paranormal experiences, but I saw that you studied a little bit with the psychological effects of infrasound.
Yeah. And
to me, that's interesting, infrasound, because a lot of people don't fully understand infrasound. The other thing is you have an article that you helped co-write dealing with the environmental appraisal of haunted houses.
Yeah.
But also, you had done an article in Haunted Magazine about the ethics in domestic hauntings. And I think that's important. It's important for two reasons. There's a lot of paranormal shows out there, and I won't name names, but there are shows, and I could even say sometimes shows I've been on, we may not have completely followed the ethics, and that is something that gets me upset, and it is something that is obviously important to the homeowner. I think you, who have really researched that, can share with us so anybody listening can start following those principles. So let's start with that. Let's talk about with the ethics. The one thing I do want to say, I've been in Paranormal TV for 21 years. I've butted heads with directors. I've sometimes sat back and even been flabbergasted by what I've experienced and witnessed and not been able to explain it. But the one thing that becomes the most disappointing thing is that when we see the final product and things are edited out and we don't get to see really amazing stuff, and then some stuff is compressed that way. That's not exactly how it happened. It kind of happened this way. That's been something for me that when I work on any show, and people that have worked with me, producers, co-hosts, can tell you this, is that I understand I'm controversial with channeling and this and that. And listen, like I said to Lloyd Auerbach, I said, Lloyd, I don't understand what's happening to me and what's going on, but it's happening. Sometimes I'm here, sometimes I'm not. That I can understand the skepticism from people, and they value that opinion. But what I've learned over the years is that I have an important thing is anybody else that goes on TV has to realize that people are watching you. You have to contribute something to this field. And it's your integrity that's on the line, but also you have to contribute something that people can learn from. But if you're teaching this and that's not the right way, you have people all over the world that might see that and go do that. And that's not replicating the thing that we want. So you wrote this article about ethics in domestic hauntings. Can you share some of those principles with us?
Yeah, I guess at its heart is me coming into the field anyway as a teenager and getting involved in domestic cases very, very early on, but also coming into this whole area of paraethics as a psychologist. Ethics is at every turn in psychology. There are so many kind of ethical considerations that we have in psychology. And I was just amazed that we're dealing with a field where every client in a domestic case, and I mean every single client, should be classed as a vulnerable client. They're all vulnerable. Often we think about vulnerable interviewees or vulnerable clients in psychology as those with maybe learning difficulties or mental health concerns or underage. Forget that. In the paranormal field, I think they're all vulnerable, especially when it's domestic cases. And at the center of any ethical considerations for any case is, are you leaving the case with the person in the same state that they were before you arrived or better?
Right.
If they're worse, ethics hasn't happened in my book. That's fundamentally what ethics is about. It's about thinking about the individual and making sure that you're leaving them not in a worse state. So that's the ethos of paraethics for me that should happen in domestic cases. In terms of how that's achieved, that's the tough one. But I think one way that you don't see it being achieved is by people not knowing their boundaries and not knowing when to overstep the mark in terms of expertise. Let's be honest, even though you and I are talking about this and we have, together countless years in this particular field, it's still a very young field. It's still very young. We still don't necessarily have all the answers. But when you're looking at a case, effectively, you could be looking at a case that has a psychological aspect to it, sociological aspect, a social work aspect to it. It could have psychiatric aspects to it. It could have neurological aspects to it. It could have paranormal, of which there are equally 10, 20, 30 possible aspects to it. Anything from a haunting to a poltergeist to telepathy to possession, you name it. It could have an environmental aspect to it. It could be physics. It could be something to do with architecture. There's a whole gamut of possible explanations. Now, each one of those, you need expertise to be able to tackle that.
Yeah.
And that's the tough thing. And it might, I don't know if it'll surprise you or surprise the listeners, but whilst I hold myself up to be an expert, and I love this field, and I've been training for donkey's years, and I've been, gathering expertise in various areas, there will still be times where I will go, that is going outside of my area of expertise.
Right.
If you don't mind, I would like to refer you to an expert in that particular area. Now, that takes a particular sort of person to do that. And I've seen in domestic cases, private domestic cases, where ghost groups go in and they try and lend their expertise to stuff about the environment or about psychology or psychiatry, and they have no understanding of it at all. And if you then start to dabble in areas in which you are not an expert and which you're not knowledgeable, you could potentially harm the person that you're talking to. You could give them the wrong advice. So there's that aspect. The other side of it is, how do you interact with that individual?
Right.
So forget the expertise. How do you interact with them? If you go into it with the mindset they're vulnerable, and I don't mean they're weak and all of that. I just mean that that they can be easily affected by what's happening to them. So if you go in with the mindset that they're vulnerable, but also you're going to do no harm, then that's a good start. But anything you do with the interaction could possibly cause harm, but it could easily have an effect. So even a simple thing like interviewing them about the experience that they've had, something as simple as that actually needs a lot of work when I look around the field and I look at ghost groups or individuals doing private domestic cases, because they don't recognize the power that they have in that relationship when they're speaking to an individual, that actually they've been brought into a home and immediately they're in a position of power, and they do nothing to kind of bring that down, to say, no, I'm not the one with the power here. It's actually the individual. It's the client. They're the one with the power. They're the one that can say, I don't want this to go any further. I don't want you to investigate. They're the one who's the expert. And that's the way you should look at it. There's various aspects of psychology, of policing, forensic work, of counseling, of therapy, various aspects of that we can draw into the field and educate ghost hunters about, that can be very helpful. So even something like motivational interviewing, for example. Motivational interviewing was originally as something that was put forward by Rolnick and Milner 30 plus years ago in a therapeutic environment. That at its heart says that the interaction between an interviewer and the interviewee is a collaboration. It's not me interviewing you. It's not me having an interview on you or at you or asking questions to you or at you. It's a collaboration between us. And as soon as you get past that point of going, I'm actually not the expert, we're the experts, and we're going to talk about it. As soon as you get past that, that's a helpful step. But I just don't see it in the domestic world. And I'm giving my quick kind of summary of various points that I made in the article and kind of academic articles I've written about paraethics. Those might seem like quite mundane aspects to paraethics. There, of course, is an extreme, and you and I are both aware of extreme circumstances where you face extreme cases. You face claims of the demonic and stuff like that. That's where you really get into, let's make sure there is no harm being caused to the individual. But even some of these foundation stuff, having empathy, having understanding, having caring, going into a one-to-one with a collaborative feel about it, that you are not in charge. All of those things can be bound up in ethics. And I think there just needs to be more sense of that, with domestic cases.
Absolutely. And it's, you discussed it really well, because it all comes down to the client. And are you actually helping the client? And if you aren't, do you have the resources they can reach out to? If I may add, I guess from my perspective, or I should say my approach, the thing that I say to people, and I've said to when I've done certain TV shows, but when I work with certain engineers, scientists, even some psychologists and other parapsychologists, when they've said, hey, I got this case, or a ghost group comes to me with a case, I try to tell the person, listen, I'm here for you. Okay.
Sure.
And I'm saying I'm here for you because no one was there for me when I was a little kid dealing with this stuff. Mm-hmm. I was told to ignore it or this and that. I was told a little bit here and there, but I didn't know how to cope with it. I didn't know, what do I do next? So I know that sense of helplessness. I know that sense of fear.
Yeah.
So, tell me what's going on. What can we do for you? And like you said, it may not have the answers. I've had cases that I just can't help. They're still having stuff and I don't understand it. It's beyond, we've tried everything. But then, of course, you have the individuals, and Adam Bly is a good friend of mine.
Okay.
And we have done some demonic cases. But he comes from a psychological counseling background where he used to work at Penn State in counseling. So he looks at it as a counseling standpoint to see, okay, are there psychological issues going on with this individual?
Yeah.
Most of the time, some of this stuff goes some of the time, it goes hand in hand. Where you have, in today's world, nobody is psychologically completely grounded. There is so much going on, and people have been through so much. But you can have that psychological issue, and you can have this entity or spirit that's happening, whether that is a existing dimensional entity or is it PK. What is it that's causing it? Sometimes you can have a multiple. Like I've had conversations with Dr. Barry Taff about this because he's really into the PK, that people will cause the haunting to occur. I'm more of, there's another consciousness there. So I agree with what you're saying, and I guess I'm holding back from my frustration that I would like to say in dealing with certain projects, because when I go to a home, and I think you're going to appreciate this, Doctor, the way it's set up is like, I don't want to know anything.
Yeah.
I want to go through a home. I want to see what I get. But then I want to meet with the client after. I want to sit down with them and I want to have a discussion. And unfortunately, that part doesn't happen. And I try to here and there, but that part is very crucial. And I think it's a very important piece because I know projects that I've done, especially I'll talk about Help My House is Haunted for one, is we have had certain clients where we've gone there and we've noticed that there's other issues as well. And there's two cases particularly that come to mind, but I won't mention them. But what we've had done is we've had production contact them afterwards just to see that they're okay if they want any counseling. And a couple times after our investigation and our reveal, we've approached them and say, listen, we're going to have someone call you and talk to you. And this is free. It's being taken care of. And it's basically counseling for them to talk with somebody. And we've had two people go 2-3 months to talk to somebody. And that's important because I had been told that, hey, listen, the mental state is very crucial in the UK when it comes to TV because there are going to be lawsuits, this and that. So we really,
duty of care and
and that was told to me.
Just thinking about this, Help My House is Haunted is a prime example, and it's lovely to hear that the work that you've done with Barry and Jane on that show, and hear that there are follow-ups.
Yes,
that's
yes,
brilliant to hear that. There are other shows that may also be doing the same. Mm-hmm. We just don't know.
Because we did that with Psychic Kids too.
The issue with that is, whilst that's good in terms of care, is you hit the nail on the head when earlier on we were talking about shows and kind of the influence that shows have. And that's where it's difficult. We talk about domestic private cases that people don't see, right? And that we're doing.
Right.
Then you talk about private domestic cases that are on television. And then you talk about, that follow-up that happens, which is not discussed. We're kind of at the mercy of producers and directors who make these decisions about what happens in the show.
Correct.
And I could imagine you and I being in a very different situation if we were sitting around a production table going, you know what, we want that 10 minutes afterwards to explain to the viewing audience that in this particular case, there are some complex other things at work. There's an interplay going on between psychology, potentially, social work issues. We can't necessarily say what they are, but there's a complex interplay. We recognize a duty of care and an ethical consideration in this. So just to tell you, here's what's been done.
That's a great point.
With this particular person, we followed up with this. And the reason why is because that potentially could then have an influence on all those amateur ghost hunters out there who will be watching the case and going, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, maybe we should start doing that. Do you see what I mean? So that's the thing. And on the flip side of that ethic, there's also, and this is why I'm not saying ethics is easy. I think it's almost an absolute nightmare when it comes to ghost hunting, to be honest, with private cases, because there's so many considerations. So even that ideal that you and I would have, knowing that there's been a follow-up, knowing that potentially there's some broadcast of what will happen, not coverage of the actual follow-up, but discussion of what's happened.
Right.
That in itself is also a little bit of an ethical consideration, because in television, you've shown the case, you've shown who the person is, and now effectively you're saying, oh, wow, there's all this complex interplay of psychology and whatever else is going on. Oh, and by the way, you see that person there? Yeah, we're going to follow up with them. So suddenly it's like, well, should you actually do that ethically? Should you be highlighting that individual in that case has to have a follow-up?
Correct.
So, I'll get on my soapbox about it, because I think we need to consider it, but it's just, it's tough.
It is, and I understand. And, in regular cases that I do locally, the client can be conversed with and things are fine. A protocol is followed. But when it's TV, there have been many projects where there's been no problem, and I've been able to work directly face-to-face with the client. But I know there was a couple occasions on Help where that did not occur, and I was very upset about that. And I know one of them particularly, the client was upset about that, because it is that interaction that healing can take place. I feel, because I've been in their shoes. And that's where some of the ethics may come into play. When it comes down to it, I feel there was a lot more I could have done and we could have done to create resolution. Mm-hmm. Now, it is tough when you're limited with the amount of time you're going to be interacting with them and that you're going to be there. We're there to help. Anybody should be there to help.
Yeah.
But in my standpoint, I'm there and we're there to also help the spirits, if there's any spirits there. And with that, you want to be getting rid of whatever's there, not conjuring or bringing something there. If a client's dealing with grieving or bereavement because they've lost a loved one and they're really hoping that we can bring them peace, allow us to attempt to do that. And, I'm just going to say this, is there was an episode, the first season, it was Queen's Oak. And we had some incredible direct voice phenomenon that I would say is no other than a demonic entity or creature with some of the voices we heard and the stuff that was in the house. And there's a whole story people don't even know, wasn't even the show. But the previous owners had stopped what they were doing and moved right out and left all their belongings because something happened that was so terrifying they did not want to go back. And then the house ended up foreclosing and these other people bought it and they bought the restaurant. And I knew that there was something else darker there, something else going on, that it wasn't just these supernatural things that were going on. There was something else there historically that may have happened a long time ago, whether it was some type of ritual or whatever. But I wanted to talk to the owners because something was leading, like, I need to sit down with the parents and the kids and get a sense if there's anything else going on around them. I was not allowed to do that. And I was very upset about that. And when we drove away, and this is probably documented, I said, you know what, it's not over for these people. It's not over. Unfortunately, we find out Barry gets an email from the owner 6 months later or so. And while I won't get into all the details, there was changes in their relationship. And one of the individuals was not their self. And they ended up getting rid of the place and I believe separating. And I was extremely upset when I heard this. And I felt that we failed because, in my opinion, if I would have got to talk to them, counsel them briefly, I believe I would have been able to recognize something or at least refer them to someone that could have helped them more. But I feel I wasn't even given that chance. So while times it's extremely rewarding for myself and especially for the clients, there are those few times it's extremely frustrating. Investigating, like you said earlier, when you get the ethics involved, I mean, I've been doing spiritual counseling for over 14 years now. And working with people and this and that. And I've had some, and if I don't understand something, I am going to bounce it off to one of my colleagues or refer them and say, hey, you need to go see a psychological counselor. Or you need to get this type of counseling, or you need some self-motivation, start listening to this person. I don't have all the answers. But in this particular case, I knew I needed to talk to them because, there are all these components of something when it's going on in the house. And you might just think it's a ghost or it's the location. But the people could be causing it, or it could be already attached and affecting the people. And if you don't help that individual, at least find out what it is, you haven't done your job. So I get frustrated.
Yeah, but it's interesting you say that because you talk about it and there's a definite sense that it could be a paranormal explanation. You talk about kind of a darker past. I equally think the same thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be something paranormal.
Right.
But it's interesting, related to that and related to what you were saying about Adam Bly as well.
Mhm.
I don't know Adam personally, but, love to chat to him because I've seen some of his work. And it's interesting hearing about your background in counselling and his background as well, and
Mhm.
kind of approaching these particular cases. But from my perspective, when we're talking about possession cases highlight for me that kind of expertise aspect. I've worked with a lot of exorcists. I've also worked with a lot of skeptics and cynics. And you meet some exorcists and they come across as very empathic, very understanding, very knowledgeable. And they will always say, well, I won't go into a case, I won't go any further if I think there's some psychological aspect to it.
Right.
Or I won't do this. I'll always have a doctor or a psychologist that I refer to bring into the case,
Mhm.
To get them to double check first.
Mhm.
My research in possession, demonic possession especially, I would be happier if every exorcist says, in a case that I'm confronted with, I will always consult a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a neurologist.
Good point.
The reason why is because those are the three natural explanations for what's going on. You can delve into kind of social work territory or kind of the social aspect as well, but those are kind of three good areas of explanations. Under psychology, there can be many. Under psychiatry, there can also be many in terms of clinical disorders.
Right.
And then under neurology, there can also be many. But I guarantee you, I know because I've done a talk in front of Royal College of Psychiatrists, for example. And I've said, look, here's a particular case, here's a possession case, what do you think? And they start spouting off all of these things about, this could be conversion disorder, or we might be seeing, some form of schizophrenia, there might be some psychotic element to this. And I go, well, that's, interesting, but what about these things that happen? What about the genuflections, where she was throwing herself to the ground on knees and swearing and praying and all of that? There's movement stuff that's going on. What's going on there? And they're going, well, I wouldn't worry about that. That's not part of our diagnosis, but it would be maybe some sort of psychotic break, something like that. They talk about the explanation, and I say, well, what about if it's anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis?
Mm-hmm.
And they go, what? Well, what is that? And I go, well, let me tell you about the symptoms of anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. And I list the symptoms, and they go, well, that's that case.
Wow.
And I go, and there you go. If you're a psychiatrist,
tell us about that. What is it?
Well, this is the amazing thing that the anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis has only kind of come onto the neurology field, I would say, within about the last 10, 15 years,
Okay.
in terms of it being a known kind of neurological disorder. But effectively, it's a form of encephalitis that has in previously been misdiagnosed as a form of epilepsy.
Wow.
Right? And
Right.
if it's treated as epilepsy, the person dies, because you can get an extreme deterioration. And actually what can happen in anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis is it can affect the brain in such a way that you get an instant mood change. And that's can often be a hallmark of demonic possession anyway.
Correct.
Is that you get that mood change. And that mood change can manifest itself in aggression, and that's physical aggression and verbal aggression. Well, the anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis can affect the kind of impulsive side of the brain, and various decision-making parts of the brain can affect it in such a way that you get that aggression, you get the spontaneous swearing, you get the aggression. You also get an aspect of it to do with the strength as well. The person is not aware of their own limitations, and they can often become incredibly aggressive in that respect. Also, because of the nature that you're dealing with encephalitis, you can potentially start to get foaming at the mouth. You can get epileptic type symptoms. So, with some epileptic fits, you often hear cynics say, you can explain all demonic possession away because of, epileptic fits, where there's the wreathing and kind of arching of the back, and it kind of gives the impression that they may be levitating when in fact they're not. It's just kind of extreme arching. Well, that is also a potential symptom of receptor encephalitis. So you've got all of these physical things, but then you also get blurring. and you can get an odd physical response, which is almost kind of a spontaneous loss and then re-engagement of motor functioning in the legs from the waist down, which then creates the genuflections where, for listeners who don't know that word, it effectively looks like they're praying, falling to the ground on their knees and then getting back up and falling to the ground on their knees. And that could be anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. I'm not saying I'm a neurologist, but I've been working with a colleague, who specializes in this sort of stuff in North America. And he kind of highlighted and went, oh, this is interesting. Maybe this could be a possible explanation for some cases, not all, but some cases in the past. But for me, it just highlights when you have an expertise in a particular area, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know it all.
Correct.
It doesn't, and that's at the heart of ethics, really, for me.
I understand. There are other symptoms or obviously, diagnosis that could be going on. I want to share something with you that I've not shared publicly. And this is something that happened to me. Now, I want to share this because I like to look at all avenues. I had a car accident in 2009. Some of my listeners know this. And I had a TBI, a mild TBI, but I lost 5 days of memory. When I say 5 days of memory, I don't remember those days. And then I have a couple years I don't remember at all. Okay. And there's I never knew what day it was, stuff like that. So I had those issues. That's a brain injury.
Right.
And my point is that I would tend to get sometimes little mini seizures because of the damage. I had a brainstem concussion. So the brainstem was stretched, as well as the front left cortex. There was a slight tear in the front left cortex. I had some damage between the C2 to C7 and a tear in the T1.
Wow. And
so when you get between the C2 to the C7, that affects your sight, your speech, all these other things, as well as the RAS, the reticular activating system, which is a huge component of our association within the environment. Now, for those of you that don't know, look up RAS, the reticular activating system. It's, the bundle of nerves that are in the brainstem. But what they found is it helps you go to sleep, helps you wake up, helps you sense that you are gauged electromagnetically in the field environment, so you know depth of perception and space, everything. So I was having vertigo, balance. When I started doing some ghost hunts again after that, the back of my neck, because of the damage, I used to always get a tingling sensation in the back of my neck when I would feel what I believed to be a spirit in the room. Now it was no longer functioning.
Uh-huh.
And because it was damaged, I didn't feel the tingling anymore. And I'm like, oh my God. So I started experimenting with certain electromagnetic devices, getting close to them and feeling them again to be able to tell the difference. And then I started working on higher consciousness and doing non-local projection and communication to go into the environment and come back. And that helped tremendously for me. But the point of what I'm trying to say is I would tend to get from my neck moving, I would get certain senses of vertigo and misbalance and a feeling of disorientation or disassociation. So this became a handicap and an unwanted distraction. During a VNG, I believe it was, I was at Rush Hospital in Chicago, and they had to hold my neck down to the left and hold my head down to the right. And I says, careful, that affects my brainstem and causes my body to shake in my central nervous system. Regardless, they were holding my head down, and then they went to the right. And then when they were done with the test, they said, okay, get up. I couldn't get up. And then when I did get up, I went into what my doctor calls a pseudo seizure, is the body went into the seizure because it was not sending information correctly to the brain and the environment. And next thing you know, I go into the seizure. I didn't feel any pain, but I had no control of my body. Okay. The paramedics show up. Luckily, the actual hospital's right next door to the doctor's office. So they put me into the bed and they took me. But now here they are trying to figure out what's wrong with me. I tell you, Ciarán, I was disassociated from my body. My body was flailing about, similar to what happens when I do channeling, a spirit comes through. But what was happening was I tried to speak and I couldn't speak. But yet what was coming out of my mouth was this gibberish, just, it was weird. And they were freaking out because they said they hadn't seen something like this before. They did a couple tests and they said, he's not having a seizure. We don't know what's going on. And then next thing you know, we're sitting in the emergency in the ambulance. And then all of a sudden I'm back in function. Okay. Did I leave my body? No. What happened was the brain was compromised to where I was not able to control the body, and the body was reacting neurologically the way it was reacting. Medically, physically, the brain stem was being squeezed, cutting off information to the brain. and therefore causing the body to go into some type of pseudo seizure. It was, to say the least, alarming to anybody watching, but clearly not paranormal. For me, this was interesting because I've had out-of-body experiences. I've had channeling, and this was different. But I felt no pain, and I said, okay, just let this happen. So for me, this experience was, if some of my colleagues or fans or whatever saw what was happening to me, it would look no different than if I was channeling or if a spirit was coming through.
Absolutely.
And I'm getting chills from saying that. So I've learned a lot about the brain and how the neurology, how it works. And then when my doctor says, oh, you can't sleep, so you need to learn about the RAS system, I found about the reticular activating system. And then I realized from certain research, oh my God, this is the network within my neck that I've had my whole life that was able to detect any changes in the electromagnetic field, whether it was man-made or what I strongly believe as spirits affecting the ether. But now that area in the neck, that sensitivity is gone. Okay, now I know body-wise where it was, and I had to learn other techniques and stuff to be able to communicate besides that. But not a lot of people know that that system is a powerful network, a time clock, a gauging system to the brain. The biggest thing is the disassociation, because sometimes I still deal with disassociation, which, as we know from brain injuries, they deal with that. They don't feel a part of the world. They don't feel connected to anyone or anything. And that feeling is similar when I come in contact to what I believe to be actual spiritual entities. And I tend to feel what I believe is also their disassociation. So I have to decide, okay, is this part of my brain injury or is this part of something that's going on spiritually or supernaturally? So I have to double check both things. And I can tell you the differences, is what I'm saying. But to complement what you're saying is someone from the outside, from a medical standpoint, well, that is a seizure. And they may be right. And then someone else might say, well, that's a possession or that's something, and they may be wrong. But then again, someone else may try to diagnose medically when it's actually a paranormal event or a spirit coming through.
Yeah, that's the thing. You go to a neurologist, they'll talk neurology. You go to a psychiatrist, they'll talk psychiatry. You go to a psychologist, they'll talk psychology. You go to a ghost hunter, they'll talk ghost hunting. Or if they've heard about things, reading a book or listening to this podcast, they've heard about little things and they'll kind of rattle off these terms, but they're not recognizing about the expertise. The same way experts sometimes, and it's ego-driven, sometimes experts won't recognize when it's out of their area of expertise. So yeah, it's a key thing. Fascinating hearing about your experience in RAS, and also fascinating hearing about the kind of sensitivity to, like you say, electromagnetic fields. And of course, a big part of what I'm fascinated by, as well as the ethics, is the whole kind of environmental aspect to hauntings. So to kind of hear that that's the case, that you are having almost those triggering episodes, that kind of physical sensation, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. When I did Dead Famous, I did other shows, and when I would do radio shows back in the 90s, I would say, I get this, I call it my sixth sense back here. I get this tingling back here that, I realize, oh, something just walked into the room. It's here. But because of that tingling, even though I'm not seeing it with my eyes or hearing it with my ears, I feel it. It's right here in the corner. No different than the spider that's on a web. And the spider lays out this entire network all over the ceiling. It can be in one corner. And if a bug is completely out of sight, but on one of the strands, it knows exactly where it is. And it races across to get there to get it. And you have various species. You have bats that will fly and use their radar. You have echolocation with dolphins. You have sharks that from over 1,000 miles away, they can detect electrical impulse in your leg when you're swimming, and they detect that electrical impulse and they go flying towards it to say, hey, something's in the water. So you have various species that have this, and that you have this reticular activating system, and some people, it might be more profound than others, is not only does it give you the fight or flight response, it controls your sleep stage, and it tells whether it's your filtering system too. It'll process information, whether information can come into the body or the brain or what information won't. And we know from brain injuries that normally their filter gets compromised. And that's part of it.
Yeah. So
that is a challenge I had to go through. But even though it's been very painful and very difficult for me, And I got very depressed after this. I said, oh my God, I lost my abilities. What's going on? Because I'd be like, oh no, that's not a ghost. That's just electromagnetic device. And I'm like, oh my God, how do I tell? When I was able to get through the emotions, meditate, concentrate, and learn, wait a minute, we are more than our physical body. Parapsychology is study outside the brain. So why don't I start focusing being outside? And that's when my awareness and perception grew. So I'm grateful for that.
Right.
But I'm grateful that now I have a respect and more of an understanding. I'm not an expert, but I have more of an understanding in what psychologists as well as parapsychologists are trying to understand in the mind, dealing outside of the body, as well as looking at, is it something wrong with the brain? Is it something wrong psychologically? Because I had to sift through those.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think also you're delving into another area. So even though kind of my area is parapsychology and I've done investigative psychology and forensic psychology work, the other area that kind of is on the periphery of parapsychology, but I think is more in tune, forgive the pun, more in tune with what you're saying, is the whole research domain, which I've been involved in, especially the last couple of years, on exceptional human experience. You know, EHEs, which is parapsychology will tend to look at things with a very scientific mindset. And whilst there'll be some of us who are truly skeptical, which means we're open-minded to the possibility, we're not dismissive, we don't, necessarily follow the hard rules of science. We do like to think outside the box. In the main, parapsychology is a science, and it will have a scientific mindset and a very positivist kind of approach to things. The exceptional human experience stuff that I've been doing with colleagues at Bucks, where I'm based, and also some previous colleagues of Rhea White, who originally came up with the term exceptional human experience, is actually recognizing that people have exceptional human experiences, whether it's near-death experience, out-of-body experiences, altered states of consciousness, which can be artificially induced through substances or any other means or injuries, the overview effect that astronauts experience when they're out in space, standing on top of a mountain and having a flow type experience. All of these are exceptional human experiences that at the end of the day, that's another part that I'm as interested in, hearing about your experience, but also hearing about the experiences that people have in haunting locations, which is they have the experience. It would be arrogant of me, even with my expertise, there's that word, even with my expertise, to attempt to explain it away if that experience was powerful and significant for the person.
Right.
The whole ethos of exceptional human experience research is saying, look, all we're interested to know is the impact that it's had on the person. We're not here to explain it away or to give all the alternative explanations. Actually, what we're interested in is understanding the phenomenology, the actual experience itself, and how powerful that can be for human beings. So, and it's the first time really that I've talked about this publicly, even though I do lots of work with Susan Brown, who kind of was as a researcher with Rhea White, and there are various others internationally that do this sort of research. I think because it sits a little bit outside of parapsychology, that I haven't talked about it so much, but hearing you talk about your experience, I'm blown away because I'm thinking about it with my EHE hat. I'm thinking, it's lovely because we're talking about it in the context of expertise, but also in the context of explanations, physical explanations, interpretation of experience. But also I'm fascinated by it because of the actual impact that it's had on you.
It's been tough, man. It's
had a huge impact.
Yes, it has, but there's been many events. My paranormal experiences growing up, throughout my life, the certain situations I've had, but then of course this car accident, suffering a mild TBI and the neck injury, has affected a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go through everything that I went through, but it's been 10 years to get to where I am right now. And there was a couple years, very dark years for me, 2012, 13, 14, that I don't remember at all. And I was just realizing my life's over, because I can't do what I used to do. I became very depressive, and I was contemplating leaving this plane. I didn't want to be here anymore. So I was trying to figure things out how I was going to leave. And the term would be obviously contemplating suicide. Not that I carried it out, but I was thinking about it. Having been one that's counseled other people, I said, Chris, you've hit a low point, you have to reach out to somebody. You tell other people to, you need to as well. And that's the problem is sometimes we feel we have to save ourselves or we have to do it instead of reaching out to someone that is an expert in that can help us. So I ended up contacting a hospital and finding out about their mental health program, specifically dealing with TBIs. So back then I wanted to learn how to cope. How do I cope with this brain injury and how do I deal with and cope with the pain? Because mentally it was hard. So I went for like 2.5 years and I met with somebody that deals with people who have had TBIs. And we worked on step by step how to not go back to the way I was, but to focus on what are the things that I can do now? What can I still do? And what things have I always wanted to do that I have the potential or the capability to do? And that's what we focused on. And that helped a lot. Occasionally we talked about paranormal and what I did and some things that came up. We had some interesting conversations about that. And it was great, and I tell people is that, we function, not obviously just not physically, but mentally, our capabilities, we have to maintain mental health. And sometimes we stumble or fall or we go through situations that we have to reach out and get help. And that's dealing with the mental and physical capabilities or limitations that we can run up against. But I tell you, it was tough, like with the first 6 months or year, because I was with an intern. They couldn't put me with one of the higher up counselors or psychologists. So I was with this intern and she was misdiagnosing me. And when I started talking about the paranormal, she started talking more about that in our sessions instead of my TBI and started labeling, well, he says he hears voices and he talks to these voices and stuff like that. But when I was talking about electronic voice phenomenon and ITC, she was misdiagnosing me. And I was told all this when I got one of the higher up psychologists and she had left, the intern had left. And I had been with her for a year and we had to do my year review. She brought this up and felt that diagnosis that the intern had left was incorrect. But I got to admit, I was really upset in not knowing that whole time that's what that intern was thinking. It was a bit comical, but I'm like, oh my God, this could happen to so many other people, be misdiagnosed, either way. And I remember calling Adam Blind. We were talking about this. Go, Adam, she was saying that I had schizophrenic tendencies or this or that because I hear voices, but I could prove the voices. I can play it back. I could go into so many other details and it's kind of comical, but luckily the psychologist that I had understands TBIs and everything, but also respected my field and what I did. And there was no discrepancies or misdiagnoses there. But I could reflect back to, I think it was 1998 around that time. My dad and I weren't getting along. We weren't talking. So my mom says, you should go talk to somebody about it. So I went and saw a psychologist. We talked about the father-son relationship. But I remember at one point I asked him if I can go back to my childhood some way. And he did a hypnotic regression on me, took me back to one of my childhood experiences. And I remember how shocked and stunned he was when I came out of it. And I remember, after seeing him for 3-4 months, I asked him, am I crazy? And he said, no, you've had some extraordinary experience that, I would love to delve in further, but we actually never did. But I think I'm kind of going off on a tangent right now. And I think that I want to mention to all my listeners that was at this point, we both got disconnected. And I guess I was talking for a little while. And at this point, it's irrelevant. So we are going to take a break and come back and get back to talking about ParaEthics with Dr. Ciarán O'Keeffe. There's a responsibility ethics on all sides, but we don't all have the answers. And that's the hard part.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We don't have the answers. And there's a lovely development that's been happening in parapsychology within the last 10 years, which is counseling parapsychology, which is recognition of that fact and using individuals like Alejandro Parra, who's based in Argentina, who has a fabulous center where it's about parapsychologists educating counselors and clinical psychologists about the difference between somebody like yourself and then somebody that has, a clinical disorder that may have some of the hallmarks, but actually it's a totally different concept and it's a totally different thing. And it's about parapsychologists also educating the clinical community about if you're presented with that case, we're not saying necessarily you need to pass it on to a parapsychologist or even a counseling parapsychologist because there's so few of us, but actually here's our recommendation in terms of how you deal with it. You're not, don't straight away jump to the conclusion that it's this particular disorder, but there are ways that you can counsel this particular person for them to have the coping strategies to deal with what they're going through. Because, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of your development and kind of various low points and various high points. People having these experiences, either whether it's communication or having a ghostly experience of some sort, will go through kind of similar highs and lows. Some people will take it on board and recognize what it is and be happy with it. Other people will genuinely not understand what is going on. Right. So I am quite happy in the way the parapsychology community has developed within the last 10 years to recognize that we have a responsibility, because we have the knowledge of this area, to be able to turn to the clinical community and go, no, actually, for these individuals, this is the way that you need to approach it. That they cannot be diagnosed in the same way that you might do traditionally, because it's a whole different idea. There's a paranormal influence here.
Right.
So, talk about, deal with it in a different way. So,
and I know there's been controversy with the dissociative identity disorder and non-pathological possession in either DSM-4 or DSM-5, dealing with where the diagnosis at one point would be that there could be a god or entity or some type of spirit actually affecting the person. And then there was some controversy from that, and they kind of changed some of the terminologies and the way it was been utilized. I've been actually studying that because I find it fascinating that there was an acceptance at one point and a diagnosis. We could talk all day about that too.
But the lovely thing in terms of the development even of that field is you've got the DSM-5 where it doesn't feature.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? The same way that maybe the field is catching up a bit, but the same way that you go back to DSM-2 and homosexuality was a clinical disorder. So that at least there's recognition. There has been a moving on now, but it has taken a little bit of time.
I just started reading this book, The Science of Spirit Possession, 2nd edition by Terrence Palmer. Have you ever heard of Terrence Palmer? Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And I just started, so I can't really ask much about it or discuss it. But I wanted to see how his approach is in regarding not only the psychological aspect, but the actual spirit attachments and stuff like that. Going back to some of the paraethics, and I think it's important to illustrate, is when you see TV, you're seeing 45 minutes that's been, obviously edited from an investigation that is anywhere from 4 to 10 hours. And I know with what we do on Help My House is Haunted, I remember when we started the first season, I sat down with Sandy and Barry. I said, listen to me. I've done a lot of paranormal TV. It's going on 20, now it's going to be 21 years. I said, every time I do a show, there has to be some type of contribution, whether it's understanding electromagnetic field, whether it's EVPs, whether it's, in this case, when it's psychic kids working with abilities in the family and getting them together. But in this case, we have to contribute somehow. Since we're going to be helping people, then we really have to help the people, put our egos to the side, but then we also have to help the spirits that are there. Let me connect with the spirits, see how I can help them and counsel if there's something there. But then also we got to look at the people. There was some issues the first season. I wasn't able to meet with the people because part of it was I don't know anything, and I go in there, and because of that, there's just not enough time for me to meet with the people. But I was always hoping I would get to meet with the people, and that was something that I brought up for the second season, which they did let me at times meet with the people in the second season. But the good news is, without going into all the other details, was we were told that their psychological background and everything like that was checked before having them on the show, and anything that's extreme, obviously, we can't put on TV, and they wouldn't be a part of that case. And there were some great cases we had. I know Barry had this amazing case he sent to them, but they said there's too many psychological issues that they can't put that on TV. Yeah. And it's fortunate they did that, but then sometimes for me, it's like unfortunate because I want to see if there's spiritual stuff that could be adding to their problem that I feel from my experience, I can help them in that particular area. Back in 2014-15, I pitched to Zach a concept for an idea called, Help, I'm Haunted. And in Help, I'm Haunted, the concept was I was going to work with a psychologist, and we were going to help people that are being haunted by ghosts or something else. And if it's psychological, then we deal with the psychological. If it's spiritual, we deal with spiritual, or we deal with both. And we could travel around the world and work with other investigators in other countries. And in him going on, he loved it, says, I want to produce this, going around, pitch it, that everybody was like, we don't want to get into the psychological thing. And I'm just like, why? I'm like, why? So for me, I was really upset. But then he's like, well, we're going to make this Help My House is Haunted. So went to the UK. Obviously, it was picked up and it became a series. But still, there's that hesitation with putting any of that psychological stuff on TV. Now, we can go do people screaming and yelling at each other, having relationship problems. We can go do shows about people being hoarders and stuff like this, drug addicts and everything else. But when it comes to the psychological and the ghostly spiritual stuff, it's too sensitive for them to put on TV.
Yeah, and there's part of it thinking about it from kind of a producer's or executive producer perspective where...
Right, I understand.
Yeah, it is too sensitive. They're thinking about how can that possibly be handled? Are we opening up a potential lawsuit here? Are we opening up a situation where potentially you've got bad press because there's a mix of the two? So from that perspective, I can kind of see, it's just going to take one producer to do it, for then all of them to come in line to see that it could actually work very well if it's very sensitively handled. I guess the ethical part of it is as soon as you start to deal with the psychology, you need to have more control over what's going to happen. So your example of saying that there are some cases that are thrown out from Help My House is Haunted because there was too much psychological stuff that was going on, and whilst you and I would probably relish in terms of being able to help in those particular cases, I can understand why they weren't on TV. The issue continuously is that the viewing audience, and not all of the viewing audience are going to be amateur ghost hunters, but a lot of amateur ghost hunters and those coming new into the field will be watching these sorts of shows and not aware of this. And not aware of an ethical standpoint that says we're not going to go any further with this case because there's too much complex psychology involved here or other issues. We're not going to go any further. And yet that, in a way, is the perfect message to have.
Absolutely.
To say exactly that, because then people will recognize, well, look, you don't say yes to every single client. You just cannot do that because there will be stuff that potentially you can't touch in terms of your expertise or your knowledge, or, there's potential stuff that won't have a resolution if you get involved, given your expertise. So it's a shame. It's a shame. But, we're here now. You and I have seen the field change in terms of television, although, let's be honest, the formats are quite similar in terms of haunting investigations, but we've seen the field change. I think it's, more popular than it's ever been because of streaming services and social media and YouTube and all of that. So potentially we could be here in a few years' time saying, oh, do you remember when we had that chat and you told me about the time you pitched it? Well, isn't it great that now you're on the third series?
Right. It's evolution.
Could see that.
We learn from what we do too. How can we do it better? And that's the thing that I look at every project that I do in every season. And I'll sit and watch the episodes and I'll get a pen and paper and I'll take notes. Okay, this wasn't explained, or this is missing from the edit and this and that. And I'll deep dive into it and say, okay, I need to explain this better because it's inside my head and what I'm feeling, what I'm seeing, as well as, wow, this needs to be shown because you didn't show that part where we helped the client. I do know that production for the second season took it very seriously, and they had counselors where they would have some people talk to counselors, but they would also have someone talk to somebody before. And one time we had a case we were going to do, but then something was uncovered in dealing with the counselor, and then that was canceled, that location, and we went to someone else. So there is a respect and an ethic from that point. And I know we had the same thing with Psychic Kids, is that it was important because you're dealing with children and you're dealing with this. And that was like a 3 to 4 day workshop, and they just documented it. But the problem is that, and this is something Edie Nathan, who was the psychotherapist that I worked with on that series, she would get really upset when we watched the episodes because all that psychological counseling she did with the parents and the kids and bringing them together, you rarely, if ever, got to see that. Because they edited it down to a 45-minute to a scary type show of the kids doing the psychic stuff, and they didn't see some of the psychological. So you have the psychology community and some of the skeptic community saying, hey, this is really bad what you're doing to these kids. You're putting them in these, but you're not seeing all the therapy and the counseling that's going on too over those 4-day period that's been edited out. So when you got 40, 50 hours of footage and they're only going to put it into 45 minutes, you have to realize that there's a lot you don't get to see. I've always thought that, some of that, even though it may be somewhat sensitive, is important, because then you see inside the person and you see this evolvement to where they evolve to where, wow, we really did help them. Here's how they were before. Here's the problems they're dealing with. And now in such a short time, here's them now. And then later, here's the follow-up, how their life's been improved. Like all of my cases that I do personally, if it's a really dramatic case, I will follow up with them in a couple weeks, 6 months, or whatever it is. If they have psychological counselors, I need to talk to the counselor first before I sit down with you and start dealing with this problem, because I want to know what medications you're on. I want to know what their diagnosis is. And plus, I want to get permission before I meet with you if you've been seeing a counselor or psychologist for a long period of time, because the communication is important for me to understand. Because, I've had cases where some guy, oh my God, it was so obsessive. And I've got actually a client right now that I've done some readings for them. But now I'm seeing that there is a psychological thing that I need to take the next step and hand them over to a psychologist. You will have someone say, there's 100 demons in my house. It's the most haunted place in the world. I'm like, and he's telling me stuff. I'm like, wow, that's pretty extreme. I got to go there. So I go there, had my friend document it. I say, you got to document this on camera, because I have this feeling that it may not be what we think it is. But if it is, we need to catch it on camera. And I found out, wow, this person's fragmented. They have a multiple personality. They are obsessive, because I noticed in the house there was things that were stacked up really oddly. And then we go into one room, it's a complete hoarding room. And then I noticed the toilet wasn't flushed, and it seems like it hasn't been flushed in a day or two. So I noticed that there was all these things that were obsessive and compulsive difficulties. And I realized that I can't help this person. So I realized there's no demonic influence. There's no hauntings. This person needs to see a counselor. And I end up telling him this, and that he needs to reach out to his counselor. What happens 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from a psychologist, and the psychologist tells me he hasn't seen him in like 2 years, but he called him up and said, hey, you need to talk to this guy. And he's like, what's going on? And I'm like, what do you mean you haven't seen him in 2 years? He should be still going to you. So he says, well, I can't get him to come to me if he doesn't want to come. I said, well, he needs to go. I guess he called his client, and next thing you know, the client calls me and screams and yells at me saying that he has a demonic possession and this and that and I must be a fraud because I'm not labeling him as possessed or having an attachment. Sometimes you get cases like this that they're just disturbing on a psychological level.
Yeah.
And this isn't something that was on TV by any means. This was just personal case that was given to me. But, when it comes to the TV show, we've been told that if there are major psychological problems, we are not going to have that case. They're not going to give it to us.
Yep.
And there was some cases that there was a lot of activity and stuff they've sent us on video that's extraordinary. But because the sensitivity and nature of these other things that people are dealing with, we can't go there. They just feel it's too liable. So then it becomes a question, if they are actually having paranormal activity, then who's helping them with that? It just gets frustrating and tough because, my hands are tied.
It is tough. It's not just about that. I know we talked about ethics a lot, but I also deal with what I call mop-up cases, where you've had private domestic cases where amateur ghost groups go in, and it's not the same for all of them. I'm not tarnishing them all with the same brush, but they'll go in, and because of their actions, they've actually created a greater problem. Right. They have done the harm that shouldn't happen in ethics. So the classic extreme case that I talked about in the magazine where I did the article was where there was a case and a group went in. The domestic case, the phenomena that started happening was something mundane. The cat had started behaving erratically. It wasn't a huge thing, just a pet. Simple as that. But the local ghost group that were called in, the first person through the door pointed at the staircase and said, oh, I can see the Archangel Michael coming down the stairs, and you've got burning figures coming out of your mirror.
What?
Now you've got a ghost group doing that. They then go and do a Ouija board for the night. They then talk about the spirits that are there. So they're actually then exacerbating a problem, right, which potentially never had to be there. Never had to be there, And that's the sort of thing that you see You do see a lot where it's about the approach that people take, and that's a very extreme example. But other examples can be if ghost groups are quite happy to use Ouija boards, for example, or seance type approaches, and they go into a domestic case and they haven't, spoken to the client and said, this is what we're going to do.
They don't have permission to do that.
The client may not want to have that sort of stuff going on. So there's it's all of the expertise stuff that we've talked about, but it's also just about behaving in an ethical way. Simply that.
And like you said in your article, and I will post that article so people can read it. Well, actually, that was in Haunted Magazine because
Haunted Magazine,
yeah, he had sent me the link, so I don't think I can post that or not, but I can at least post where people can get the copy because that's important.
On my academic page, my ResearchGate, I've got a copy of Ethical Guidelines for Haunting Investigations, which was a few years ago now, but that's a free copy available.
Excellent. This was something that I had brought up to Jane and Barry. We discussed because we had one particular case. I won't go into the details, but there was a narrative that based on the history, what had happened in that location, that they believed that's what was causing it. But when I got there, that wasn't the case. It was bad. It was spiritual, supernatural. It was what I would call an infestation, but it was not this particular thing. So I'm focusing on this, they're focusing on that. And I got upset because if you're focusing on this, which is not here, you could be conjuring or bringing that to there, and we're not here to conjure up spirits to come to this place and talk to us. We're here to get rid of whatever's there and find out what's going on. And that was a huge thing with me that I caused a confrontation because that got into the ethics. Now, I understand some of the stuff I talk about is controversial, and I understand, but I think if people really know where I'm coming from and all the experiences I had in my life, they said, okay, well, you've experienced all these things, so you're seeing stuff we may not see. But I like to have those experts. Like I've called in some cases when we're filming, and I've called somebody up in the USA, say, I got to talk to you. I got this. This I don't understand. I did that with Adam Bly. We did that with the elemental cases. I didn't know anything about elementals. And here was this thing that I saw, and I'm getting on my recorder going, what? I'm in new territory, okay, with you guys in the UK and these elementals. So I know that, hey, I'm not going to try to be somebody I'm not. So let's call somebody that is an expert on that particular topic. And that's what we try to do as well. But there can be perspectives to where people don't see what you see, and you can butt heads a little bit because you believe you know what's better. And then TV might say, well, we're not going to go down that route, or here's what we want to do, or we're not going to put this in, or you can't talk to the client.
Yeah.
That's and then it gets upsetting because when we leave that place, where I'm doing a case here in Illinois or around the United States, or even on the TV, when we leave that place, like you said, we have had to done something to help that person, either the spirits there or that person, and not leave them in a worse situation. I don't know if you ever saw the episode we did. It was in, I don't know the location, Nottinghamshire. I don't know the places because they never tell me, and I can't remember after we leave. But it was a place where there was an infestation, and there was two entities, if I remember correctly, and I was doing rituals to get rid of them. A lot of stuff people didn't see. We had the cross go flying off the wall twice. Jane saw this little figure race across the room that she's never seen before, which I go into some of the little elemental creatures. But there's a whole backstory of what happened to this family and the particular woman that we can't put on TV. And this gets into some major attacks by an entity. Okay, that was too sensitive. And this goes into the original entity case of the 1970s, very similar. And that was not allowed. And I was told after I did my walkthrough, the person came up to me and shared with me some of these other experiences. And then I go to the director, I go, holy cow. He's like, well, we can't talk about that. So there's things you can't talk about. But at the very end, when we presented the evidence we had, which we believe evidence, some of the ITC responses that were reflecting that, when we looked at the client seemed more worried and shocked, like, oh my God, because now they had the validation because people she's tried to talk to thought she's nuts. But now she's like, and I'm like, wait, we're supposed to help her, not make her more like this. But as many people know, hearing electronic voice phenomenon, hearing these voices can be very shocking and startling. So we explained things and we went more detail. We said we'd have people to talk to. And I've still been in touch with the person since then. I mean, things have helped and things are great now. But in a situation like that, it doesn't end just when we leave. So individual might be like, oh, you've made this worse. No, we continue. You know, Barry, myself, or Jane will continue talking to these individuals afterwards to see how they're going. And Barry, which you don't get to see the second season, is he does follow up with them and sees how they're doing. It's just not documented and put on the show. That they may bring that back for a third season. But this goes into ethics. And sometimes the ethics is out of our hands in the editing room because they edit that stuff out and they don't narrate it in. They don't talk about it.
Yeah.
But this is a great subject that you're bringing forward to the community. And it's something that I'll be more than happy to share more with people, is that this needs to occur moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. They can. It's so influential what you and I do on television and what anybody does on paranormal programs. You know, you can't underestimate the influence that these shows have. You know, even to the point, I'm going to be controversial now.
Sure.
Given all of the ethical considerations and that you have talked about and how ethical,
right?
You know, you've been in those cases, and given, you know, Help My House is Haunted and the follow-ups and all of that sort of thing, it's a tough call. But you know, you kind of go, well, the message there is about, you know, the ethical side, which is the fundamental, integral, and most important aspect of dealing with domestic cases, is the ethical side.
Right.
And yet that message is just not there. It's absolutely not there. And that might change. We might see, you know, there might be a sea of change as we see more of this and the community talks more about ethics. We might see that change and might see kind of follow-ups, and that's good. But if we don't see that, I'm very much from the school of thought that when it comes to private domestic cases, I seriously don't think we should be putting them on TV now.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from.
You've had that experience, and you're talking about kind of a frustration that there is the ethical follow-up, there is the duty of care, there is ethical considerations from, you know, your involvement. But you and I both know that we are all kind of victims of the editing room.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So even voicing our concerns, we're not in the position to have control over those sorts of things. And I would argue that unless the message is very clear in these broadcasts that all of the ethical stuff has also been thought of. There are follow-ups, there are duty of care, there are psychologists and counsellors involved, there is follow-up with all of the investigators who each have their different perspective. Unless that is the message, and that's very clear, because then that becomes influential out in the real world, in the field.
Right.
Unless that happens, it's almost like you should just go, well, you know, let's leave it well alone, because otherwise the message then becomes, even for a show like Help My House is Haunted, is here's a domestic case. We're going to do this. We are victims of the editing room. So you're only going to see a small, you know, a snapshot. And you and I get it. Not everybody does. The viewing audience doesn't necessarily get that. So you've got that we're victims of the editing room. But also you've got that the message going out there is here's a domestic case and here's how we're going to deal with it.
Right.
And it's just 45 minutes,
right.
You know, and then that becomes the influence for then what amateur ghost hunters do in both continents and across the world when they watch the show is they will try and mimic and learn from these shows that they see. And it's not necessarily the case. I recognize it's a big influence. And I recognize as more ghost hunters come into the field, they will find their own approaches, their own beliefs, their own perspectives. And I value that and respect that. But the TV world, you know, TV shows, streaming, social media, they all have an influence.
I agree.
You know, and it's great that you've tried to pitch various shows that kind of tackle some of that. But the frustrating thing that you and I are feeling is that it's just not going anywhere.
Right.
That we're not seeing that kind of ethical stuff pushed forward, you know, in the mainstream media. And I can kind of understand why, but it is frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I would love people to see, you know, the behind the scenes where the producer comes up make sure the family's okay, if they can get them anything, if they need to talk to anybody, if they get emotional, stuff like that. There is that empathy, there is that compassion, and there is that follow-up. And sometimes when we're going to the next case and shooting and a week or two has gone by and we say, hey, remember the case we did a couple weeks ago or last month? They've been working with a counselor. They reached out and we have a counselor that's working with them now. I just want to let you guys know. I said, okay, that's good to know. Let us know how it goes. So we've had that communication. That's something that the executives, we discussed in the second season, and something that they followed up on. So I am very happy about that part. It's just, when the networks get the show, they're like, oh, take that out, take this out. We don't want that. And the editors and the director says, well, they're not going to like that. And we've had stuff that's too sensitive. We had a gunshot that Jane, when we were at the cricket house, and I was trying to connect with this man that was a cricket player, and he'd shot and killed himself in the house. So I wanted to understand what led up to that psychologically. What was he thinking? Why did he do that? And then afterwards, was his soul at peace, or he's still there? And he was still there. But during this session, when we talk about residual energy, we talk about place memory, I tend to say, take me back to that time. And as I said that, and the event unfolds as I feel the death occur, Jane caught on a recorder a shotgun, the sound of a shotgun, that when she was analyzing it the next day, she calls us and you've got to hear this, and you hear this shotgun as I am doing the channeling. Now, what's remarkable about that is Jane's been doing this 20 years. This was one of the greatest EVPs she captured. For me, it was normal because I had caught residual energy before, such like on Dead Famous with Billy the Kid, the gunshot when he was going down the stairs. So I've learned when you get in this consciousness, this collective of the past, you can access it. We know this with hypnotic regression. You go back to your childhood or go back to a past life and you're there. So I do that from an awakened state, a conscious state, but I allow whatever's there in the ether to present itself. And sometimes we capture that on ITC. It was considered, it wasn't used in the show. And I'm like, why wasn't this used? Because not only is this fantastic for paranormal, the field and ITC, but it's fantastic for us to start to understand a little bit more about place memory and residual energy, that events are recorded within time in those areas. And sometimes we can not only feel it or see it, such as a ghost go by, but the ghost's not really there. It's just a loop. But we can actually record the sound from that time period. And that's something I wanted to push further, but unfortunately it wasn't used because the show had a time slot that was considered too sensitive. I can kind of understand that, but I'm looking at the research part. I'm looking at the contribution to the field, as I'm sure you would appreciate too. So there's a fine line that we have to say,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can see that. And I can see the ethics almost playing in the head of, the producers and those people going, the time that this is aired, and thinking about the sensitivity. Absolutely.
Yes.
But it's interesting what you say about contribution to the field, because that's another, I wouldn't say bugbear of mine, but I think it's another crusade that we need to get on. Ethics is one.
Please explain to the listeners and myself. I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, so ethics is one kind of crusade and my soapbox. I think the other one is about contributions to the field.
Okay.
That parapsychologists, we are involved in the scientific study of this stuff, but we're not many. I would say actual parapsychologists in the world today, qualified up to PhD level, maybe a few hundred. Compared to physics, chemistry, biology, it's nothing. It's a tiny, tiny field. And out of those hundreds, only a small number are involved in looking at haunting experiences and kind of field work. The data from investigations would help us, but would also help the ghost hunting field in terms of moving the field forward and really understanding some of this stuff. And what I get frustrated by is the fact that you've got thousands upon thousands of ghost hunters going out into haunted locations, and they're collecting evidence. So you gave an ITC example. They're collecting that evidence, photographic evidence, video evidence, but also environmental evidence. They're capturing that too with some of their devices. But they're all doing it in different ways, slightly different ways. Sometimes they're doing it incorrectly. Sometimes they're doing it correctly, but they're still using different devices, or it's not calibrated, or they're maybe not using it the right way. And some are doing it the right way. But can you imagine a situation where every ghost hunter goes out into the field and collects their evidence. And you can differentiate between, well, here's the paranormal evidence, here's the ITC, here's the photo, here's the voice, here's the video, here's somebody talking about their sense of presence, the account. That's one part of the evidence. Then you've got all the environmental monitoring part of the evidence, looking at things like EMF, infrasound, humidity, temperature, all of that. Can you imagine, literally a database of all of this stuff worldwide, where we can then effectively start to advance the field? Because at the moment, we're advancing it by talking about it. You're advancing it by telling me about that incident with the shotgun and us trying to interpret it and kind of understand what's going on there. Jane is kind of advancing it by saying, here's something significant. Here you go. But can you imagine how much further forward the field would go if we could collect all of this data in the same way, so that we're able to do these comparisons? That would be a dream. That would be amazing.
For everybody listening to what Ciarán just said regarding this, you have any solutions how we could do this? I am more than welcome to go for this, because that's why I'm still here on this planet, is to contribute. And I know that Barry, myself, and Jane, our frustration when we watch the show is they show some of our great evidence, but there's a lot of evidence you don't get to see. And we're like, well, what we do with this? What we do with this great evidence that's just, we know is so revealing and can help. A quick example is, you talk about infrasound. An extraordinary event that occurred when we were at Fulford Mansion was, as a medium sensitive, I see all these soldiers that are coming forward. I'm like, okay, they're talking to me like, are you going to help us? Are you the one here to save us? And I go, what do you mean? And it had to do with prayers that they were stuck there because of their belief system, their religion. They died there. They didn't go back to their village. They weren't given a proper burial and released so they felt they were all stuck there. So I had to talk to the owner. They wouldn't let me talk to the owner till the morning. Find out, yes, there were hundreds of battles on this land over centuries, going back to 1,000, 2,000, 1,500 years ago. And so there could be millions of bodies here. So I go outside. This is what's important, because this, I think, is an extraordinary contribution to starting to research further, is I go outside. It's in the morning. We've got the crew. I got my recorder, and I say, okay, spirits, how many of you soldiers are here? I play it back. Sounds like it says thousands. And I'm like, holy cow, why are you still here? We died here. Okay, why didn't you leave? No one prayed for us. Well, I said, listen, I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to help you. Can you please first give us a sign that you're here? Now we have this documented. All of a sudden, you start hearing animals yelling out. You hear geese, you hear ducks, you hear a dog barking, you hear cows from all over the place. And we're on hundreds and hundreds of acres, and the crew starts freaking out going, we've been here 2 days filming general views and stuff. We haven't heard this. What's going on? I know what's going on. It's the infrasounds being affected, right? So I'm like, shh, because animals can hear when there's earthquakes, or they can sense when there's vibration, seismic activity. So that means that something's happened in electromagnetic field that is causing all these animals to respond and yell out, right? When I play back the recorder, you hear faintly, they found us. Yay! Now, I hear this. I'm like, oh my God. So I play it. I describe it. Our sound technician, Owen, I said, we got to analyze this. So we're analyzing this and we amplify it. And he's like, oh my God. He's like, I hear it. I go, what does it sound like to you? He sounds like it's like a crowd of men cheering. And I said, but they're cheering. And as they cheer, all the animals start yelling because it's an uproar. It's affecting their environment. I go, this is significant. This is attaching how ghosts and spirits can react or affect the environment, but then also we can't hear it, but those that can hear down into infrasound, such as animals, can be affected by this. So what do I do with this, right? Unfortunately, they used the scene and they have the narration, but they didn't put the audio clip in there from my recorder. You hear the animals, but you don't hear the audio clip. So I'm like, well, what do I do with this extraordinary
very frustrating
piece of data, which I will be more than happy to send to, and you could listen to it. Yeah. To me, this is extraordinary people got to see this on the cricket player where I went outside with the miners, and something said in my head, Chris, don't you record it this time, get Jane. Jane was a little skeptical of me during the season. A lot of people don't know this, and which is good. So they said, don't you record this? Let her record. I said, Jane, you got your recorder? I go, yeah, record this. She's like, why? I said, well, all the miners are here, and I'm going to tell them I'm going to pray for them. You're going to catch them cheering. She's like, okay. The next day, you got to hear this. She caught them cheering, and that's in the show. She plays it at the end, the reveal. So what's happening is that for myself and for you is I need to have the validation just as well. But I want other people to say, hey, listen, just don't take my word for it. Let's try to collect the data of what I'm doing and then validate what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling. But then what do we do with that data and all that other stuff to validate that interaction?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you bring that up. And hey, anybody got answers or we could talk later on. And if we come up with something and somebody wants to take on this project and this database, I have, and anything that anybody's seen on the shows, yourself or anyone that you work with, if you want that data, you want that audio, send it to you and you can analyze it yourself and we can discuss from a scientific standpoint. I'm more than happy to do that because that means a lot to me. It's all about the contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's about the contribution. But like I said, it's about moving the field forward as well, isn't it? You know, it's about having that data, having the discussions, understanding all the different perspectives, the interpretation, but also having the collective data to be able to go, well, we can move this particular theory forward. So, yeah.
Right. Brilliant. And I know you and I could probably talk for another hour or two, and I know it's getting late for you.
Bedtime territory now.
Before we leave here, now you have a couple websites, and can you talk to us about those two websites that you have?
Okay, so one of them is www.theschoolofparapsychology.equid.com, and that is an online school that I have. There's only a few courses that I've gone on there. In the past, I've done more extensive courses, kind of 10-week courses about parapsychology or about kind of poltergeist and that sort of stuff, but I'm just incredibly busy at the moment. I'm doing writing projects. I'm involved in investigations. I've got my university career as well. So I've kind of cut down a little bit on that, but there are still a couple of these short courses available, one on ghost hunting and kind of the parapsychological perspective on that, but also one on exorcisms and demonic possession. And
cool.
You get to hear from exorcists as part of that. And it's about the psychology, psychiatry, and neurology. So I have that and kind of there's a few different things there. So people can look at that for that side of things. I also have a website on ResearchGate. So ResearchGate is an academic, it's a kind of a very geeky network. It's almost like a geeky Facebook thing where you can go on ResearchGate, type in my name, Ciarán O'Keeffe, and you can find my profile and you click on research and it basically lists all of my academic research. And for the majority of that, you can download it for free. If you can't download it, there's normally a button that says request full text. It sends an automatic message, private message to me, and I can send you the article privately because some journals, they won't allow you to release it for free. But if you request it privately, then I can do that. So it's a way of sharing all of my academic research into parapsychology and various other things for free. So do check that out.
That's great stuff. And everybody listening, I will have the links on my planetparanormal.com Spirit Talk page. You can click on the links and access what Doctor's talking about. Ciarán, I really appreciate you coming on here. We're going to have to chat again, definitely. I consider you a colleague.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much.
Yes, there's a lot we could talk about.
Absolutely. No, it's been lovely chatting with you. It really has. It's been long overdue.
Yes.
And I hope it's the first of many in-depth chats about this field and how we can save the world, basically.
Hey, we can do the best we can with the time that we're here.
Exactly. No, lovely chatting with you.
You too. This is Chris Fleming and Ciarán O'Keeffe. Thank you for listening to this month's edition of Spirit Talk.